Welcome to Tales of Warriors channel. Today, we will dive into the riveting world of covert operations of the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad. This is a compelling stories collection, unveils the clandestine endeavors of Israel's renowned intelligence agency, delving into thrilling accounts of daring missions, strategic triumphs, and the remarkable individuals behind them. Join us on a journey through Mossad's daring covert operations. In this video, we will discover the next 3 operations of Israel's Secret Service legacy. This video is suitable for those who have free time, are ready for bed, driving, or need something as background while studying, cleaning, or relaxing. Episode 13. The Syrian Virgins. On a stormy night in November 1971, an Israeli Navy missile boat was struggling against the raging Mediterranean waves as it plowed its way toward the Syrian coast. It had left the big naval base in Haifa in the early evening, sailed along the Lebanese coast, and entered the Syrian territorial waters. The darkened boat passed by the illuminated Latakia port and kept its northbound course. It finally moored at a safe distance from a deserted beach, close to the Turkish border. Naval commandos of Flotilla 13 emerged on board of the wildly swaying boat and launched a few rubber dinghies into the water. When they were ready to depart, the door of a locked side cabin opened, and 3 men in civilian clothes came out. Their faces were concealed by checkered keffiyehs, and in their watertight bags they carried small transceivers, forged passports, personal belongings, and loaded revolvers. Without uttering a word, they jumped into the dinghies and headed toward the beach. The commandos were not told their identities or the reason they were bringing these men to Syria. As they approached the coast, shortly before daybreak, the 3 civilians dove into the icy waters and swam toward the beach. They crouched in the surf till they saw the silhouette of a man waiting in the sand. They swam the last few yards and joined him. This was Yonatan, codenamed Prosper, their leader. He had brought dry clothes for his shivering friends and they changed right away. He took them to his concealed car close by. A stranger, apparently Mossad's local auxiliary, was waiting at the wheel. He started the car and deftly merged into the traffic on one of Syria's main highways. A few hours later, they entered Damascus. They checked into 2 hotels. After a long sleep, they got together and set out to reconnoiter the Syrian capital. They all were former Flotilla 13 commandos, now Mossad agents, and were on the most unusual mission of their lives. Among them was David Mollad. The operation had been planned a few weeks earlier, at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. The Ramsad, Zvi Zamir, the head of Caesarea, Mike Harari, and a few other department heads met with the 4 young men, who were between 23 and 27 years old. The 4 of them were close friends, had participated in several operations together, mixing their naval commando skills with their Mossad training. All of them were born in North Africa and spoke excellent French and Arabic. They called themselves the Cosa Nostra, like the Sicilian Mafia. Zamir began to brief them. 2 years ago, a message had come from Syria. It had been sent by the leaders of the dwindling Jewish community. The autocratic regime of President Hafez al-Assad, who had seized power in 1970, oppressed and persecuted the local Jews. Many of them had trickled out of the country, leaving behind a tiny, aging community. The young and able men had escaped from Syria, leaving behind Jewish girls who had no hope of finding husbands. Their best option was to escape to Israel. Some of the girls, Zamir told the Cosa Nostra, had tried to escape via Lebanon, with the help of smugglers they had bribed. Some of them had been captured, beaten, tortured, even shot. A few had still managed to get to Beirut. All of them had the address of a safe house in the Lebanese capital. Local Mossad helpers had taken care of them until they could be brought to Israel. One night, in the winter of 1970, an Israeli missile boat approached the port of Jauni, north of Beirut, and local fishermen brought over the 12 Jewish girls who had fled Syria. The captain of the Israeli boat was a veteran sea wolf and a submariner, Colonel Avraham Zabu Ben Zayev. Before the operation, he and his men had undergone very rigorous training on a model they had built at a Navy base. The training had been excellent, and the transfer of the girls on board had been smooth and efficient. Zabu had his men throw blankets on the badly frightened, shivering girls, served them sandwiches and coffee, and then sailed full throttle to Haifa. He docked at 4 a.m. and, to his great surprise, saw the unmistakable figure of Prime Minister Golda Meir waiting on the wharf, along with the chief of the IDF staff, General Chaim Bar-Lev, and his deputy, General David Dado Elazar. Golda threw a modest party for the Syrian girls and was deeply shaken by their stories. During the following year, Ben Zayev and his successor on the job, Amnon Gonen, carried out a few more operations, bringing a few more young Syrian girls from the Lebanese coast to Israel. But crossing the Syrian-Lebanese border had become a very risky business, and the Arab smugglers and fishermen could not be trusted. Golda decided then that she must bring the remaining girls directly from Syria to Israel. She called Zamir and instructed him to rescue the Syrian girls. At the meeting with the Cosa Nostra, Zamir addressed the 4 young men. "You have to rescue those girls. That's your assignment." A heated debate broke out in the conference room. "Is this a job for Mossad agents?" one of the men asked. "This task should be given to the Jewish agency." Another angrily added that the Mossad was not a matchmaking agency, and its officers should not have to risk their lives in one of the most dangerous and cruel Arab countries just to ensure that a few Jewish virgins would find grooms. The Ramsad did not budge. He reminded his men that rescuing the Jewish communities in enemy countries was one of the Mossad's missions from its very inception. The operation was codenamed Smika, Hebrew for blanket. The day after the Cosa Nostra landed on Syrian territory, their self-confidence improved. They walked the streets of Damascus, chatting in French. They checked their surroundings and made sure they were not followed by the Mukhabarat, the dreaded Syrian intelligence service. Later that day, they strolled in the illuminated markets of the city, and entered a jewelry store. Prosper and Claudie, Emmanuel Alon, were examining the jewelry, conversing in French, when the merchant bent toward them and whispered, "You are from Bnai Amenu, Hebrew for our people, aren't you?" The agents were stunned. If they were so easy to identify, they were in mortal danger. They ignored the merchant's remark and quickly slipped out of the store and disappeared in the crowd. The news about the chance to escape Syria and reach Israel had spread among the young girls of the Jewish community. "Our situation in Syria was very bad," Sarah Gaffney, one of the young women, said later. "We were under pressure to marry, but whom? There was nobody. We heard a lot of stories and rumors, and we became obsessed with the idea, to get to Israel, to the land of the Jews." A message was secretly delivered to Prosper: "Tomorrow evening, the girls will be waiting in a small truck not far from your hotels." The following evening, indeed, the Cosa Nostra found the small truck, its back covered with a canvas roof, parked in a dark street. The agents had previously checked out of their hotels and carried their bags with them. 2 of the Cosa Nostra sat in the front of the car, and 2 others got in the back. Under the canvas roof were several girls, between the ages of 15 and 20, and a teenage boy. The Cosa Nostra were wearing keffiyehs again, covering their heads and leaving just a narrow slit for their eyes. They knew that on the Syrian highways, the army and police often established barriers and checkpoints. They decided that if they were stopped by the police, they would say that the truck was taking the girls to a high school field trip. The local auxiliary, who had brought over the truck, was driving. He picked up a couple of girls in pre-arranged locations and then headed north, toward Tartus. They reached a deserted beach. The young Syrian Jews and the agents hid in an abandoned hut. Far from the beach, an IDF missile boat was waiting. Prosper signaled the boat with his flashlight and called them on his radio. The rubber dinghies, manned with Flotilla 13 commandos, started making their way toward the beach. All of a sudden, bursts of gunfire echoed very close to Prosper and his friends. They scrambled for cover, but soon found out that the shots were not aimed at them. Who was firing? Had the Syrians detected the flotilla dinghies? Mess on the beach, the Naval Commando's chief, Gadi Kroll, radioed to Israel. But he did not give up. He called back the flotilla dinghies and sailed north, to an alternative beach that had been selected beforehand. Simultaneously, Prosper and his men rushed the girls back to the truck, drove north, and again made contact with the Navy boat. This time, the beach was quiet. The girls and the Cosa Nostra men, their keffiyehs again masking their faces, waded in the water up to their waists, and jumped into the dinghies that took them to the open sea. After a long and bumpy sail in the stormy waters, they finally boarded the Navy boat that turned back to Israel. The agents disappeared in a cabin, the girls were taken to another, and ordered never to say a word to anybody about their escape from Syria. They had left their families in Damascus, and if their flight to Israel became known, their parents could pay for it with their lives. The local auxiliary drove the truck back to Damascus, to prepare for the next operation. The missile boat arrived to Haifa without any further incident. But before sending out the boys on their next mission, the Mossad tried to find out who had fired that night on the beach. The intelligence department checked spies' reports, activated its sleepers in Syria, contacted its sources in the army, but to no avail. They concluded that the incident might have been a badly planned ambush or a nervous response by Syrian soldiers to suspicious movements in the water. The next time, the Cosa Nostra arrived in Damascus by air. They came from Paris, using the cover of archaeology students, coming to visit Syria's antiquities. They carried false papers, and their pockets were full of metro, the Parisian subway, tickets, coins, receipts from cafes and restaurants, and other tangible proof of their assumed identities. Their documents were in order, yet they were nervous and edgy. Perhaps the Mukhabarat had blown their cover? They went through immigration without any problems, and yet they could not calm down. They crossed the crowded arrival hall of the airport and left for the city in several taxis. The Cosa Nostra settled in different hotels. Claudie checked into the Damascus Hilton. This time, the first night they spent in Damascus was tense. The four young men knew well that if they were caught, their fate was sealed: torture and horrible death. They asked the auxiliary to take them to the square where a few years ago the Syrians had hanged Israel's greatest spy, Eli Cohen. Standing at the very place where the body of Cohen had hung from the gallows, while a fanatic crowd cheered and waved its fists, was too much for them. Claudie left his friends and ran back to his hotel. He was deeply shaken by the experience. Haunted by the sinister image of the square, he tossed and turned on his bed, but could not sleep. Suddenly, at midnight, he heard a noise coming from the door, and immediately knew what it was: a key being inserted in the keyhole. That's it, he thought. They've got me. I'll be the next to hang in the city square. He rushed to the door and looked through the peephole. What he saw was an elderly American tourist trying in vain to open the door. After several failed attempts, she walked away. It turned out that the lady had got off the elevator on the wrong floor. Claudie felt reborn. While they waited for the next group of girls to be prepared, they walked Damascus's streets and visited cafes and restaurants. The waiters gaped in amazement at the quartet of François, Frenchmen, who split their sides laughing during the meals. It was all Claudie's fault. He repeatedly succeeded in dispelling his buddy's tremendous tension, and his own, by improvising bombastic speeches in French, inserting words and jokes in Hebrew slang. This and future operations were flawlessly executed, until the day when Prosper and his friends noticed unusual traffic and large concentrations of troops along the beach. They could not risk an operation on the heavily patrolled coast. Prosper decided to change the itinerary. Go to Beirut? He told his helper, and they raced to Lebanon's capital, 100 kilometers away. After crossing the border into Lebanon, Prosper headed for Jouni, a port north of Beirut, inhabited mainly by Christians. In no time he rented a boat, a mid-size yacht, after explaining to its owner that he wanted to take about 15 guests on a pleasure cruise, a surprise party for one of his friend's birthday. Once the boat was secured and ready for departure, he cabled in code his superiors in Paris and informed them of the change in plans. Shortly after, he received confirmation by the same channel. That night, the truck came from Damascus, carrying its usual load of young Jewish women. Claudie was at the wheel. The truck stopped a few kilometers from the Lebanese border and unloaded its human cargo. Claudie continued, alone in the truck, presented his papers at the border checkpoint, and crossed into Lebanon. There he stopped the truck on the roadside and waited. The young women, carrying their heavy suitcases, escorted by the Mossad agents, walked in the darkness for hours, stumbling on the rock-strewn ground and bypassing the border control barrier. After an exhausting march, they reached the road on the other side of the border, and met with Claudie, who drove them to Jouni. They boarded the yacht, one by one, and finally the yacht sailed on its birthday voyage. In the open sea, the girls were transferred to a Navy boat. The Cosa Nostra spent the following day in Beirut, strolling and shopping. At night, they headed back to Damascus by the same way they had come. A few kilometers before the border, 3 of the agents got off and made their way in the dark fields around the checkpoint. Claudie crossed legally with his vehicle, met his friends down the road, and took them back to Damascus. The day after, they were on their way back to Paris, and to Tel Aviv. The operation ended in April 1973, when Golda Meir came to Haifa Naval Base to personally thank Prosper, Claudie, and their friends for what they had done. Between September 1970 and April 1973, the Mossad and the Navy had carried out about 20 operations for bringing young Jews and Jewesses from Syria via the Tartus beaches and the Lebanese coast. All the operations were successful, and about 120 young people were brought to Israel. The operation was kept secret for more than 30 years. That was the end of the Cosa Nostra. Its members turned to more peaceful activities, like business, tourism, and civil service, even though they were still called back for special Mossad operations once in a while. Time passed, and Emmanuel Alon, Claudie, was invited to the wedding of a relative. He was introduced to the bride and recognized her immediately. She was one of the virgins he had helped bring over from Syria. He asked her, "Where do you come from?" The girl paled. She felt she was still bound by the secret of her past. Alon smiled at her. "Didn't you come from Syria? By sea?" The stunned woman almost fainted, and then all of a sudden grabbed his arms, hugged and kissed him warmly. "It was you," she mumbled. "You took me out of there." This moment, Alon said later, was worth all the risks we took. Episode 14. Today we'll be at war. On October 5, 1973, at 1 a.m., Mossad agent codenamed Dubi got a phone call from Cairo. Dubi, a senior case officer, operated from a safe house in London. The phone call was a tremendous shock. On the line was the most important and most secret agent of the Mossad, whose very existence was known only to a select few. He was known as the Angel. In some reports, he was codenamed Rashash or Hot El. The Angel uttered a few words, but one of them made Dubi shudder. It was chemicals. Dubi immediately called the Mossad headquarters in Israel and conveyed the code word. As soon as it reached the Ramsad, Zvi Zamir, he told his chief of staff, Freddie Amy, "I am going to London." He knew he had no time to lose. The code word, chemicals, carried an ominous message: expect an immediate attack on Israel. Israel was expecting an attack by its Arab neighbors since the 1967 Six-Day War, in which it gained large chunks of territory: the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank and Jerusalem from Jordan. The IDF was now deployed on the Golan Heights, on the eastern shore of the Suez Canal, and along the Jordan River. The Arab countries were rattling their sabers, promising revenge, but in the war of attrition that had followed the Six-Day Battles, Israel had the upper hand. All its efforts to trade the newly conquered territories for peace had been angrily rejected by the Arab states. In the meantime, Egypt's fiery President Nasser had died and been replaced by Anwar Sadat, a man lacking charisma, regarded by the Israeli experts as weak, irresolute, and unable to lead his people to a new war. After the death of Prime Minister Eshkol, Israel's leadership had been entrusted to the strong hands of charismatic Golda Meir, a tough and powerful stateswoman, assisted by the world-famous Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan. Israel's security, it seemed, couldn't be in better hands. A few weeks before the phone call, in utmost secrecy, King Hussein of Jordan had flown to Israel and warned Golda that the Egyptians and Syrians were planning an attack on Israel. Hussein had become Israel's secret ally and was engaged in intensive negotiations with Golda's envoys. But, at the time, Golda was not focused on Hussein's warnings. She was much more interested in the forthcoming elections, and Golda's Labour Party campaigned under the slogan, "All is quiet on the Suez Canal." Barely 18 hours before Yom Kippur, it appeared that nothing was quiet on the Suez Canal. Zvi Zamir took the angel's warning very seriously. According to the pre-arranged procedures, triggered by the code word, the Mossad was to meet his agent in London, as soon as he got the signal. Zamir boarded the first flight to London. On the 6th floor of an apartment building in the British capital, not far from the Dorchester Hotel, the Mossad kept a discreet safe house. The apartment was bugged, serviced, and secured by Mossad agents. It had been acquired and equipped for only one purpose: meetings with the angel. As soon as Zvi Zamir arrived, a detachment of 10 Mossad agents took positions around the building, to protect their chief in case the signal from Cairo was part of a plot to capture or injure him. The head of the unit was veteran Zvi Malkin, the legendary agent that had helped catch Eichmann in Argentina. Zamir, tense and agitated, waited for the angel all day long. His agent apparently had made a stopover in Rome, on its way from Cairo, and reached London only in the late evening. The two men met at the safe house at 11 p.m. In the meantime, Yom Kippur, the holiday of prayer, fasting, and atonement, had settled upon Israel. All work had ceased, the television and radio had stopped their broadcasts, no cars moved on the roads. Skeleton army units manned the borders of the Jewish state. The meeting between Zamir and the angel lasted 2 hours. Duby noted every word. It was close to 1 a.m. when the meeting ended. Duby invited the angel into another room, where he paid him his customary fee of $100,000. Zamir, frantic, hurriedly composed an urgent telegram to Israel. But the Mossad agents couldn't find the embassy encoder to transmit the vital message. Finally, Zamir lost his cool and placed a call to Freddie Aney's home. The calls were not answered and the harried operator told him, "There is no answer, sir. I think today is an important holiday in Israel." "Try again." Zamir growled. Finally, the ringing woke up his chief of staff and he picked up the phone. He sounded half asleep. "Take a basin of cold water," Zamir said to him. "Put your feet in it and pick up pen and paper." When Freddie did as he was told, Zamir dictated the code phrase, "The company will sign the contract by the end of the day." Then Zamir added, "Now get dressed, go to headquarters, and wake everybody up." Freddie followed Zamir's orders to the letter. He started calling the political and military leaders of Israel. His message to them could be summed up in one sentence: war will break out today. Shortly afterward, the telegram that Zamir had written finally arrived in Tel Aviv. According to the plan, the Egyptians and the Syrians are going to attack in the early evening. They know that today is a holiday and they believe that they can land, on our side of the Suez Canal, before dark. The attack would be carried out according to the plan which is known to us. He, the angel, believes that Sadat cannot delay the attack because of his promise to other Arab heads of state, and he wants to keep his commitment to the last detail. The source estimates that in spite of Sadat's hesitation, the chances that the attack will be carried out are 99.9%. They believe they'll win, that's why they fear an early disclosure that may cause an outside intervention. This may deter some of the partners who then will reconsider. The Russians will not take part in the operation. The Ramsad's dramatic report was not accepted by everybody at face value. General Eli Zira, the handsome, confident chief of Amman, was convinced that there was no danger of war, in spite of the worrying reports by intelligence sources. He believed that the huge concentrations of Egyptian soldiers and armor on the African shore of the Suez Canal were nothing but a part of a large army maneuver. Zira also admitted, in a conversation with Samir, that he had no explanation as to why a report by Unit 848, later renamed Unit 8200, 848 was the listening and monitoring installation of the IDF, stated that the families of the Russian military advisors in Syria and Egypt were urgently leaving those countries, a surefire indication of imminent war. The chief of Amman and most of the defense community leaders were firm believers in conception, a theory that Egypt would attack Israel only under two conditions. First, that it would receive from the Soviet Union fighter jets able to face the Israeli fighter aircraft, as well as bombers and missiles that would reach Israel's population centers, and second, that it would assure the participation of the other Arab countries in the onslaught. As long as these two conditions had not been met, the conception said, there was no chance that Egypt would attack. Egypt would make threats, would tease and provoke, would carry out mammoth maneuvers, but wouldn't go to war. But the theory had already failed before, in 1967. That year, a large part of the Egyptian army was in Yemen, where it waged a prolonged war against the Royal Army. Israel was convinced that Egypt wouldn't initiate any provocative or aggressive action as long as part of its army was tied up in the Yemenite quagmire. But on May 15, 1967, the elite units of the Egyptian army suddenly crossed the Sinai and reached the Israeli border while President Nasser expelled the United Nations observers and closed the Straits of the Red Sea to Israeli shipping. Israeli experts should have realized the failure of their logic, but in the afterglow of the astonishing victory of the Six-Day War, it was forgotten. The conception theory hovered over the extraordinary cabinet meeting called in the early hours of October 6, 1973. Not only Zira, but several cabinet ministers as well doubted the report about an imminent Egyptian-Syrian surprise attack. Twice in the past, in November 1972 and May 1973, the Angel had flashed Israel a warning about a forthcoming attack. True, he had retracted at the last moment, but in May 1973, huge numbers of reserve soldiers had been urgently mobilized, and the operation had cost Israel the staggering sum of $34.5 million. At this morning's cabinet meeting, everybody was conscious of the gravity of the situation. Nevertheless, they only decided on a partial mobilization of reservists. The ministers also decided not to launch a preventive strike on the huge Egyptian concentrations of troops along the canal. Zamir returned to Israel and stuck to his guns. War is imminent. He quoted the Angel's warning of a joint offensive by the Egyptian and Syrian armies, shortly before sunset. At 2 p.m., Zira summoned the military correspondents to his office and stated that there was only a low probability of war breaking out. He was still speaking, when an aide walked into his office and handed him a short note. Zira read it, and without another word grabbed his beret and hurried out of the room. A few moments later, the wail of the air raid sirens shattered the silence of Yom Kippur. The war had begun. After the war, senior Amman officers angrily accused the Angel of having misled Zamir by mentioning the end of the day as the H-hour for the attack, while the real offensive had started at midday. Only later it was established that the H-hour had been modified at the last moment, in a phone conversation between the presidents of Syria and Egypt. The Angel was already in the air, on his way to London. It seems strange that the Amman chiefs were disturbed by the Angel's mistake, or by his former mistaken warnings. Apparently, Amman's chiefs regarded the Angel not as an intelligence source but as the Mossad's representative in the office of Egypt's president, who was supposed to report, in full detail, everything that happened there. They ignored the fact that, in spite of his senior position, the angel was only a spy. He produced excellent reports, but did not always know everything, as is the case with any other spy. During the Yom Kippur War that broke out that day, the angel kept supplying Israel with first-rate intelligence. When the Egyptians fired 2 Scud missiles at IDF troop concentrations, a reassuring report by the angel calmed the Israelis. The Egyptian army had no intention of using more missiles during the fighting, he said, and Egypt wouldn't escalate the war against Israel. The Yom Kippur War ended on October 23. In the Golan Heights, the Syrian army had been routed, and the Israeli cannons were positioned 20 miles from Damascus. In the south, the Egyptians had occupied a strip 5 miles wide on the Israeli shore of the Suez Canal, but their Third Army was completely surrounded by the Israelis, who had established a bridgehead in Egyptian territory, broken the Egyptian lines, and attained new positions barely 63 miles from Cairo. Still, Israel could not rejoice with this victory. The war had cost them 2,656 lives, wounded 7,251, and the myth of its superior power had been destroyed. Yet negotiations had started between Israelis and Egyptians, and accords were signed, first for the ending of hostilities, then for establishing durable peace between the two nations. Syria refused to join the peace process. Zvi Zamir completed his tour of duty and was replaced by General Yitzhak Haka Hafi. Zamir retired amid general praise for his achievements. He was acclaimed for being the only one in the intelligence community to have warned about the military preparations of the Syrians and the Egyptians, and for bringing the crucial report about the imminent attack on Israel. If Israel's leaders had been more attentive to his warnings, and ordered an immediate preventive strike, it is highly probable that the results would have been far better for Israel. Certain cabinet ministers maintained that Israel refrained from preventive action so that it could not be accused of starting the war. Not only does this seem contrived, it seems a nearsighted decision. For what was more important, that Israel not be accused of triggering the war, or that it protect itself with all the means at its disposal? And yet, the Israeli historian Dr. Yuri Bar-Yosef maintains that the angel's warning saved the Golan Heights. On the morning of October 6, he wrote, tank crews had been urgently mobilized following the angel's report. These crews reached the Golan in the afternoon and stopped the Syrian advance in the Nafa sector. At the war's end, under unprecedented public pressure, Israel's government appointed a board of inquiry, headed by Supreme Court Judge Shimon Agranat, to investigate the decision-making process during the Yom Kippur War. The board ordered the immediate discharge of General Eli Zira, and several other officers, including Chief of Staff David Elazar. But who was the angel? An unending flow of stories, reports, and books, all of them erroneous, about his identity have been published throughout the years. It was obvious that the angel was somebody very close to Egypt's governing circles and Egyptian army supreme command, but no one ever pierced the armor of secrecy that protected his real identity. Journalists and analysts called him by several code names and painted a figure blessed with legendary talents. He became the hero of many spy stories and even some best-selling novels. After his discharge, General Zira carried his frustration deep in his heart. He was determined to prove his innocence and reveal his version of the 1973 events to the world. He finally decided to write a book, and give his own answer to the question, why did he reject the angel's report? The general wrote that the angel was nothing less than a double agent who had been planted in the Mossad by the wily Egyptians in order to mislead the Israelis. Some reporters bought Zira's story, and wrote that the angel was indeed a double agent par excellence. The angel's role, they explained, was, over a length of time, to deliver to Israel truthful and accurate intelligence, in order to win its trust, and then, when the Mossad was practically eating out of his hand, feed it a monstrous lie that would destroy it. It was a great story. It explained everything, almost. Because both Zira and his followers chose to disregard one single fact, all the angel's reports, from the very beginning until the very end, had been absolutely accurate. So where was the lie? And when the angel could mislead Israel and inform it that the massing of troops on the Suez Canal's shore was just a maneuver, and there was no danger of war, the double agent chose the opposite solution. He called Zamir's aide in England and sent him the warning, chemicals, then flew to London and warned Zamir that the surprise attack was imminent. But Zaira could not be stopped. In 2004, when a new edition of his book was published, he went a step further and revealed the angel's identity to the public. In a series of interviews, culminating with a television news show hosted by veteran journalist Dan Margalit, Zaira used the angel's real name: Ashraf Marwan. The name stunned all those familiar with the Egyptian political circles. They could not believe that Marwan might be an Israeli spy. But who was this master spy? Who was Ashraf Marwan? In 1965, a sweet, shy Egyptian girl met a charming and handsome young man at the Heliopolis tennis court. The girl, Muna, was the third daughter in her family and not exactly the smartest. Her sister Huda was more gifted and an A student at the Giza High School. But Muna was cute, charming, and her father's favorite child. The young man she had met came from a respectable and well-off family. He had just graduated with a B.S. in chemistry and had joined the army. And Muna fell for him, head over heels. Shortly afterward, she introduced her boyfriend to her family. That's how the young man met Muna's father, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was not sure that his daughter had met the ideal match, but she did not leave him any choice. Finally, Nasser invited the young man's father, a senior officer in the president's guard, to his office, and the two men agreed that their children should get married. A year later, in July 1966, the young people were wed. Soon after, Muna's young husband was posted at the chemical department of the Republic Guards, and at the end of 1968 was transferred to the Presidential Department of Science. The name of the president's son-in-law was Ashraf Marwan. The young man apparently was not satisfied with his new job. He asked Nasser for permission to pursue his studies in London. Nasser agreed, and Ashraf Marwan, alone, settled in England's capital, under the close supervision of the Egyptian embassy. But the supervision, apparently, was not close enough. Ashraf Marwan loved the good life, the parties, the adventures, and London of the 60s generously supplied all of that. It didn't take long for the young Egyptian to spend all his allowance. He needed another source of financing for his nightly pleasures, and soon he found it. Her name was Suad, and she was married to the Kuwaiti Sheikh Abdullah Mubarak al-Sabah. Ashraf charmed the romantic lady and she opened her purse in return. But the arrangement did not last long. The affair was exposed and an angry Nasser had the bad boy sent home in disgrace. Nasser demanded that Muna divorce the adulterer, but she flatly refused. Nasser finally decided that Marwan would remain in Egypt and be allowed to go to London only to deliver his papers to his professors. Marwan also had to pay back all the money he had received from Suad al-Sabah. He got a job in Nasser's office, and once in a while he would be charged with petty tasks or missions. In 1969, Ashraf Marwan came to London again, to submit an essay to the university. But on that occasion, he also took the first step to betraying his father-in-law. His humiliation by Egypt's president had left him bitter and frustrated. He did not hesitate, he phoned the Israeli embassy and asked to speak to the military attaché. When an officer answered, Marwan identified himself by his real name, and bluntly said that he wanted to work for Israel. He asked that his offer be forwarded to the people dealing with this kind of activity. The officer who received his call did not take him seriously and did not report the call. Marwan's second call also remained unanswered. But the story reached some Mossad officials. The chief of the Mossad European section, Shmuel Goren, received a phone call from Marwan. Goren knew who Marwan was aware of the man's important position, and asked Marwan not to call the embassy anymore. He gave him an unlisted number and immediately alerted some of his colleagues. Goran's top-secret report was handed to Zvizimir and to Rehavia Vardi, the head of Tsamet, the Mossad department for agent recruitment. The two of them appointed a special team to check Marwan's offer in depth. On the one hand, Marwan's move had all the characteristics of a classic sting operation. Somebody high up in an enemy organization volunteers as an agent, and no effort is needed to recruit him. That seems very suspicious. The man can be a double agent, sent over as bait by the Egyptian services. But on the other hand, the same equation might have the opposite meaning. Somebody high up in the enemy organization volunteers as an agent. He certainly must have access to ultra-secret material that nobody else can provide. Perhaps, after all, he was the ideal agent, the one every secret service in the world dreamed about? Besides, Vardi's men knew who Marwan was, an ambitious young man, a hedonist, therefore somebody who loved money. The temptation for Mossad recruiters was great. Goran returned to London and asked to meet Marwan. Marwan agreed and arrived elegantly dressed, ever the handsome young man. He openly told Goran that he had been deeply disappointed by Egypt's defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War, and had decided to join the winner. But beside that ideological motive, Marwan asked for lots of money, $100,000 for every meeting in which he would deliver a report to his handlers. Goran was inclined to accept the offer, in spite of the huge cost. Such sums had never before been paid to a Mossad agent. But first, Goran needed tangible proof that Marwan was as good as his word. He asked him for a sample of the secret documents he could deliver. The delivery of the documents would also tie Marwan to the Mossad. It was self-incriminating, solid proof that Marwan had become an Israeli agent. From the Egyptian point of view, that would make him a traitor and an enemy agent. Marwan did not let Goran wait long, and brought the full minutes of the talks held by President Nasser with the leaders of the Soviet Union in Moscow, on January 22, 1970. In that visit, Nasser demanded that the Soviets supply him with modern, long-range jet bombers that could carry out bombings deep inside Israel. The document astonished all those who read it. They had never seen such a paper, its authenticity was beyond doubt. Now the Mossad chiefs realized that they had a fabulous treasure in their hands. They appointed Dubi as Marwan's handler and sent him to London. They also took immediate care of all the arrangements, renting an apartment in London for the meetings with the Angel, equipping it with hidden listening and recording devices, securing it, establishing a special fund for the financing of their star agent. The games could start. The meetings were initiated by Marwan himself, whenever he had something to report. According to the rules established with Dubi, Marwan would make a phone call to a middleman. Some sources claim that he used to call Jewish women in London, and the Mossad would be alerted. Marwan provided his handlers with lots of intelligence and top-secret political and military documents. Colonel Mayer, the head of Branch 6, Egyptian Army, in Amman, participated in several of those meetings. Mayer used to fly to London under an assumed identity. All identifying labels would have been removed from his clothes. He used to move around London for hours, by foot, in cabs and buses, to make absolutely sure he was not followed, then, finally, reach the apartment building and go up to the 6th floor. When he came to the apartment the first time, he met there a handsome but unpleasant man, who openly disdained him and condescendingly glowered at him. Marwan softened up only when he realized that Mayer was a man of vast knowledge and experience. Once, Mayer was asked by his Mossad friend to bring a briefcase to Marwan. When he asked what was in the case, his friend winked at him and said, "A penthouse in Hamdina Square, the most exclusive neighborhood in Tel Aviv," hinting that it carried a fabulous sum of money. According to Mossad estimates, Marwan's reports during his secret service for Israel cost the Jewish state more than $3 million. Nasser died on September 28, 1970, and was replaced by Anwar Sadat. Professor Shimon Shamir, one of the foremost Egypt scholars in Israel, analyzed Sadat's character for the Mossad. A feeble, dull man, Shamir said, he stressed that Sadat would not stay long in power or go to war. Many of Egypt's leaders thought the same, but Marwan decided to back Sadat unconditionally. He took the keys to Nasser's personal safe from his wife, collected the most important files and documents, and brought them to the new president. He stood by him again in May 1971, when some of Egypt's leaders conspired to carry out a pro-Soviet coup. Some of the most famous names in Egypt were among the conspirators: Ali Sabri, a former vice president; Mahmoud Fawzi, a former minister of war; Sharowi Guma, minister of the interior, and other ministers and members of parliament. The plan was to assassinate Sadat during his visit to Alexandria University. But Sadat moved first, and arrested all the conspirators. Marwan stood by him, and assisted Sadat when he smashed the conspiracy. The results were not long coming. Marwan's position in the Egyptian hierarchy vastly improved. He was appointed presidential secretary for information and special advisor to the president. He accompanied Sadat on his trips throughout the Arab world and took part in top-level political talks. As Marwan's status improved, so did his reports. In 1971, Sadat traveled to Moscow several times, and presented Leonid Brezhnev with a shopping list of the weapons he needed to attack Israel. The list included, among other things, MiG-25 aircraft. Marwan delivered the list to his Mossad handlers. When they asked for the minutes of the Sadat-Brezhnev talks, Marwan brought that, too. Zvi Zamir was profoundly impressed by Marwan's reports, and met him in person. The material provided by Marwan was distributed to a few senior Mossad and Amman officers, the IDF Chief of Staff and his deputy, Prime Minister Golda Meir, Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan, and Golda's confidant, Minister without portfolio Israel Galalai. Some of Marwan's material apparently landed on the desks of other secret services. He approached the Italian Secret Service and offered to work for it as well. According to one source, he also established contact with the British MI6. That explains why, on that fateful October 5, when he was on his way to meet with Zvi Zamir in London, he made a stopover in Rome. He informed the Italians, too, about the forthcoming war. Another one of his reports had reached the Italians before, but this was by means of the Mossad. A month before the Yom Kippur War, Libya had asked for Egypt's help. Palestinian terrorists, in the service of Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, intended to shoot down an El Al plane during its takeoff from Rome's airport. This was meant to be an act of vengeance against Israel for mistakenly shooting down a civilian Libyan aircraft over Sinai in February 1973. The Mossad had obtained evidence that Palestinian terrorists were planning to hijack a plane, load it with explosives, and crash the plane in one of Israel's big cities, see Chapter 12. When a plane flying the Libyan colors emerged over Sinai, refusing to identify itself and to leave the Israeli-controlled space, the Israeli Air Force controllers concluded that this was the suicide bomber's aircraft. They launched a couple of fighter jets that shot the plane down. It was later established that the airliner had strayed from its course because of a sandstorm that raged over Sinai. The Israeli medics found 108 bodies among the aircraft's smoldering debris. Gaddafi swore to avenge the victims. The team to carry out the operation numbered 5 Fatah terrorists, led by Amin al-Hindi. President Sadat decided to help the Libyans and ordered Marwan to deliver 2 Russian-made Strela missiles to the terrorists. Marwan sent the surface-to-air missiles to Rome via the diplomatic pouch. In Rome, Marwan loaded the missiles into his car, met with al-Hindi in a shoe store on the world-famous Via Veneto, entered a carpet store with him, and bought 2 large carpets. Together they wrapped the missiles in the carpets and transported them, by subway, to the Palestinians' safe house. The terrorists prepared to launch the missiles, unaware that Marwan had already alerted the Mossad, and the Mossad warned the Italians. On September 6, the anti-terror squad of the Italian police broke into an apartment in Ostia, close to the Rome airport. The Italians arrested some of the terrorist team members and seized the missiles. The other members of the team were apprehended in a Rome hotel. The Italian press named the Mossad as the source that had alerted the Italian services. Some maintained that during the operation, Zvi Zamir himself was present in Rome. A month later, the Yom Kippur War broke out. After the war, Marwan kept fulfilling major secret tasks for Sadat. He was sent as Sadat's envoy to Arab capitals, and was active in the separation of forces between Syria and Egypt, and Israel. He was also present at the talks between U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and King Hussein of Jordan in Amman. The separation of forces gave Marwan the opportunity to connect with another secret service, the American CIA, which was looking for credible intelligence about Egypt's policy after the interim agreements with Israel. According to American sources, the secret relations between Marwan and the CIA lasted almost 25 years. He visited the United States several times for medical treatment and enjoyed a warm welcome and generous hospitality, courtesy of the CIA. But even his senior position and secret activities lost their appeal, and Marwan started a second career in business. He bought a luxurious apartment in London, at 24, Carlton House Terrace, and started investing his money in various projects. In 1975, Ashraf Marwan was appointed chairman of the Arab Industrial Union, an organization founded by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf Emirates in order to produce conventional weapons by Western methods. The project failed, but it helped Marwan to establish valuable contacts in the business world. After a short term, he was removed from his position, and in 1979 he moved to Paris. 2 years later, after the assassination of President Sadat by fanatic terrorists, he moved to London and started a brilliant business career, which made him a very rich man. He hosted his Mossad handler Dubi in a hotel he owned in Majorca, in the Balearic Islands, and let him know that he was retiring from the world of espionage. Some claim that by the end of the 70s Marwan felt the Egyptian soil burning under his feet, and that he was suspected of maintaining secret ties with Israel, so he decided to leave both Egypt and the Mossad for good. In the following years, Marwan made a series of fabulous business deals. He invested his money well, and soon bought a part of the Chelsea Football Club, while competing with Mohammed Al-Fayed, the father of Princess Diana's boyfriend Dodi, for the purchase of the upscale Harrods department store in London. He stuck to his hedonistic lifestyle, was always well dressed, and a string of love affairs trailed in his wake. Some CIA agents, who came to see him once in his New York hotel, had to wait outside until his current paramour dressed and cleared out of his suite. In the 80s, Marwan's name was linked to several arms-running deals for Gaddafi's regime in Libya and the terrorists in Lebanon. An American journalist reported that he invited a CIA agent to his home, led him to the terrace, and pointed to a shiny Rolls-Royce parked outside. "This is a present from Gaddafi," he said. The story about Marwan's terrorist connection seems to be pure fabrication. Marwan wouldn't have dealt with terrorists and risked a confrontation with the Mossad that could expose his past as an Israeli agent, sentencing him to certain death. If Marwan had delved into shady deals with Libya or the terrorists, it could have been only in full cooperation with the Mossad. But years passed by, and in 2002, a book titled A History of Israel came out in London. The book was written by the Israeli scholar Aaron Bregman, and mentioned the spy who had warned Israel of the forthcoming Yom Kippur War. Bregman called the spy the son-in-law. This was a hint that the spy was close to an important personality, and the angel was Nasser's son-in-law. Bregman wrote that the man had been a double agent, who provided Israel with false information. The book did not reveal Marwan's name, but it did rouse his anger. He reacted in an interview in the Egyptian Al-Aram newspaper, in which he mocked Bregman's research and called it a stupid detective story. Bregman, offended, decided to defend his honor, and in an interview with Al-Aram openly stated that the son-in-law was indeed Ashraf Marwan. This was a grave accusation, but it lacked any proof. It did not have any impact, till the day when Eli Zira declared that the double agent who fooled Israel was, indeed, Ashraf Marwan. Such a thing had never happened in Israel before. The identity of former spies was not revealed, in many cases, even after their death. And Ashraf Marwan was alive, vulnerable, and easy prey for the killers of the Egyptian Mukhabarat. Zvi Zamir came back from 30 years of retirement and tried to establish contact with Marwan, but the angel refused to speak with him. He didn't want to, Zamir dolefully said, because he felt I didn't protect him. I did all I could to protect him, but I did not succeed. Following Zaira's revelations, Zamir broke his self-imposed silence and harshly attacked the former Amman chief. He accused him of revealing state secrets. Zaira hit back, claiming that the former Mossad was protecting a man who was nothing but a double agent. Israeli journalist Ronen Bergman, who watched a live television broadcast of an official ceremony in Egypt, saw President Hosni Mubarak warmly shaking the hand of Marwan, who accompanied him in laying a wreath on Nasser's tomb. After the broadcast, Bergman wrote that Marwan had been a double agent. As for President Mubarak, he flew to the succor of Marwan and firmly rejected the rumors of his being an Israeli spy. Israel was engulfed in a flood of accusations and counter-accusations. The Mossad and Amman established two boards of inquiry that reached the same conclusion: Marwan was not a double agent and did not cause any harm to Israel. Zaira did not give up and sued Zamir in a court of law. The former Justice Theodore Orr, who had been appointed arbitrator by the court, firmly ruled that Zamir's version was the true one. Zaira and his supporters apparently chose to ignore the fact that Marwan had been one of the leading figures of the Egyptian government, the son-in-law of Nasser and close advisor of Sadat. The leaders of Egypt did not want to admit that one of their own had been a traitor and a Zionist spy. Such an admission would have shocked the Egyptian public opinion and shaken the Egyptians' trust in their leaders. So they chose a different approach: to laud and praise Marwan in public, but seal his fate in secret. In early June 2007, Justice Orr published his findings. On June 12, an Israeli court officially confirmed Zamir's account on Marwan's role in the service of the Mossad. 2 weeks later, on June 27, Marwan's body was found on a sidewalk, under his terrace. Israeli observers accused the Egyptian Secret Service of the murder. Many accused Zaira, claiming that by his reckless behavior he had caused Marwan's death. On the other hand, in a hardly surprising statement, Marwan's widow accused the Mossad of murdering her husband. Eyewitnesses said that they had seen men with Middle Eastern features standing with Marwan on his terrace, minutes before his death. The Scotland Yard closed and reopened the case, and finally stated that it was unable to find the perpetrators. The angel's murderers still remain free. Episode 15. A honey trap for the Atom spy. Except for carrying a sign that read, "I am a spy," Mordecai Vanunu seemed to have done all he could to expose his secret life. He was a technician at the Dimona atomic reactor, the most secret and secure installation in Israel. The foreign press, as well as many governments, was convinced that Israel was building nuclear weapons in that top-secret facility. Anybody who applied for a job at Dimona had to go through a long, rigorous process of filling out forms, submitting to interrogations, undergoing background checks by the Shabak and other security specialists, until, at the end of the exhausting procedure, they were cleared to enter the secret compound. The intensive surveillance and close scrutiny continued throughout one's employment at Dimona. Vanunu applied for a job at Dimona after he saw an ad in a daily newspaper. He filled out a form at the Nuclear Research Facility office in nearby Beersheba, was subjected to a routine security investigation, and got the job without any problems. How was this possible? He was a left-wing radical, his friends were Arab members of the communist, anti-Zionist Raqqa Party, he participated in protests at their side, was photographed in extreme pro-Palestinian rallies, carried signs, made speeches, and gave interviews to the media. He also hosted Raqqa militants in his small Beersheba apartment, and asked to join their university cell, exclusively composed of young Arab radicals, openly hostile to the State of Israel. In Ben-Gurion University, where he was registered as a student, he was known for his extreme views. He was a gifted but unstable young man. Before he became a Raqqa supporter, he had been a right-wing extremist and an admirer of the racist Rabbi Kahane. He later supported the extreme right-wing party Haydakia, Revival, voted for the Likud, and finally landed in the extreme left. He claimed that the controversial 1982 Lebanon War had made him change his political opinions. A loner, with almost no friends, he firmly believed that he was discriminated against because of his Moroccan origins. That conviction grew when he failed the admission tests for the Air Force Academy and was posted to the Engineer Corps. After his discharge from the IDF, he started engineering studies in Tel Aviv, changed his mind and moved to Beersheba, where he started studying economics, changed his mind again and switched to philosophy. He became a vegetarian, then a vegan. His classmates were impressed by his lust for money. He boasted that he did not have to work, just to invest smartly in the stock market. In his diary, he gave the stock market top priority before philosophy and English. He drove a red Audi, made some money as a nude model, and, at a student party, pulled down his drawers to win a prize. His way of life was his own business, of course, but his political activity as a Raqqa sympathizer and a Palestinian supporter should have sounded 1,000 alarms. Instead, he was called to a meeting with Shabak officials, who told him to stop these activities and asked him to sign a document stating that he had been warned. He did not sign and did not stop. The Shabak described Vannunu's activities in a routine report to the Director of Security in the Ministry of Defense. The director conveyed the report to the Director of Security at the Dimona reactor, who filed it in one of his folders, and that was it. No action was taken, and no surveillance of Vannunu was initiated. A remarkable oversight. A whole chain of people, Shabak officials at local and national levels and the directors of security at the ministry in Dimona, had failed to do their duty. Vannunu continued his political activities and was not bothered anymore. He was an operator at Institute 2, the most secret department in the Dimona compound. Out of the 2,700 employees at Dimona, only 150 were allowed entrance into Institute 2. Vannunu had 2 badges, 9,567-8 for entering the Dimona facility, and 320 for entering Institute 2. From the outside, the institute looked like a modest 2-story building that could be a storage facility or a marginal utility unit. But people with inquisitive minds would notice an elevator cabin on the flat roof, and wonder why a 2-story house needed an elevator. The key to this mystery was the real secret of Institute 2. The elevator was needed to go not up but down, to the 6 underground floors that were artfully concealed. Vannunu was in charge of the night shift and knew the building well. The first floor was divided between several offices and a cafeteria. A few gates on the ground floor were used for the transfer of uranium rods used in the reactor. On the same floor were some more offices and some assembly labs. On the first underground floor were pipes and valves. On the second, the central control room and a sort of terrace, called Golda's Balcony. Important visitors with maximum clearance could watch the production hall beneath from that balcony. On underground floor 3, technicians worked on the uranium rods that were lowered from above. On level 4 was a large underground space, rising to the height of 3 floors for the production plant and the separation facility, where the plutonium produced in the reactor was removed from the uranium rods. The 5th floor housed the metallurgic department and the lab where the components of the bombs were produced, and on the 6th underground floor, chemical waste was loaded into special containers. Vannunu knew that during the normal operation of the nuclear reactor, the chain reaction produced plutonium that accumulated on the uranium rods. After being shaved from the rods, it was used on levels 4 and 5, and in the assembly of Israel's atomic weapons. One day, for no particular reason, Vannunu took a camera to Institute 2. He brought it in his bag, stuck among the books that he would take later to class at Ben-Gurion University. If he was asked by the security screeners why he had brought a camera to Dimona, he intended to say that he had taken it to the beach and forgotten it in his bag. But nobody checked his bag, nobody asked questions, and he stored the camera in his personal locker. During the lunch and evening breaks, when nobody was in the building, Vanunu would wander in the underground floors, photograph the labs, the equipment, and the halls, draw detailed sketches, enter the empty offices, and peruse documents in open safes. Nobody saw him and nobody suspected him. The security guards seemed to have evaporated into thin air. Vanunu's superiors had no idea about his dangerous hobby, and evaluated him as a quiet, serious, and diligent technician. At the end of 1985, Vanunu was fired after 9 years in Dimona. His dismissal was not connected to his political activities but was part of budgetary cuts at Dimona. He was let go like many others. He received a 150% severance package and 8 months' wages as an adaptation grant. Yet, again, he was angry and frustrated. He decided to go abroad for a long trip, and perhaps never return, if he could find a new home, like 12 million Jews who lived outside Israel. He sold his apartment and his car and liquidated his bank accounts. The 31-year-old Vanunu shouldered his backpack and set off on his trip. He had gone on long trips before, once to Europe and once to the United States. Now he headed for the Far East. In his bag he carried the 2 films he had shot at Dimona. His first stop was Greece, then Russia, Thailand, and Nepal. In Kathmandu, he met an Israeli girl and courted her bashfully. He introduced himself as Morty and openly admitted that he was a left-wing pacifist, and perhaps he would not return to Israel. He visited a Buddhist temple and toyed with the idea of becoming a Buddhist himself. After Kathmandu, Vanunu traveled the Far East and finally landed in Australia. For a few months, he worked at odd jobs in Sydney, but most of the time he was lonely and miserable. One evening, he strolled through one of the most disreputable neighborhoods of the city, a haven for prostitutes, petty thieves, and drug dealers. From the darkness, in front of him, emerged the spire of the St. George Church, a known refuge of tormented souls, desperate people, criminals, homeless wanderers, poor and oppressed men and women. He walked in and met the Anglican priest John McKnight. The good priest immediately realized that Vanunu was looking for a home and a family. He established a close and warm contact with his shy, insecure guest. In the next weeks, the two of them had long and sincere conversations, and finally, on August 17, 1986, Vanunu was baptized Christian, and chose a new name: John Crossman. It was a huge transition for an observant Jew, born in Marrakesh, who had spent his youth in the Talmudic schools and yeshivas of Beersheba. True, his religious zeal had waned years ago, but his conversion was more a product of his instability and confusion than of his disappointment with Judaism. If he had not walked into St. George Church and met Father John, he might have converted to Buddhism or some other religion. But by turning his back on Judaism, he also turned his back on Israel. His aversion to his country gradually became one of the major motives for his future actions. During a social meeting at the church, Vanunu told his new friends about his work in Israel, described the Dimona reactor, and offered to make a slideshow with the photographs he had taken. They gazed at him vacantly. They had no idea what he was talking about. But there was one man in his audience who became intrigued by his words: Oscar Guerrero, a Colombian wanderer and an occasional journalist. The two of them had painted the church fence, and had lived in the same apartment for a while. Guerrero realized the importance of the photos and fired up Vanunu's imagination with promises of fortune and glory. Vanunu badly wanted money, but he also thought he could use the promised glory to promote peace between Jews and Arabs. This was not his original plan. Peacemaking had not been the reason why he left Israel and carried the 2 rolls of film around the world for many months. But making peace and saving the world from Israel's atomic bomb became an allegedly noble motive for his actions. His private war against the Israeli nuclear project gained steam as the days went by, and turned into a major reason for publishing the Dimona photographs. But Vanunu also understood that if he did so, it would be his end as an Israeli. He would never be able to return to Israel, where he would be branded as a traitor and enemy of the state. Still, the temptation was great. Vanunu and Guerrero went together to a photo lab in Sydney. They developed the pictures he took of Institute 2, and tried to peddle them to the local offices of American magazines and Australian television stations, but in vain. They were regarded as either oddballs or swindlers trying to make an easy dollar. Nobody believed that the shy, ascetic young man held Israel's most guarded secret in his hands. Finally, Guerrero flew to Spain and England, and this time he struck gold. The editors of the London Sunday Times, who heard his story, realized the dramatic potential of an article on Israel's nuclear reactor, based on exclusive photographs and drawings. Yet they had to be extremely cautious. Not long ago they had been badly hurt by buying Hitler's diaries, which turned out to be a second-rate hoax. Therefore, they asked to thoroughly examine the material that Guerrero had brought over. In the meantime, an official of Australian television got in touch with the Israeli embassy in Canberra and inquired if the strange man who had offered them the photos of the Dimona reactor was indeed an Israeli citizen. The story came to the attention of an Israeli journalist, who reported it to his newspaper in Tel Aviv. Like a thunderbolt, a stunning blow shook Israel's secret services. A former operator at Institute 2 in Dimona was trying to sell Israel's most vital secret. The system failed. We did not get to him in time, helplessly admitted Chaim Karman, then Director of Security at the Ministry of Defense. The news was rushed to the Prime Minister's Club, Prime Minister Perez and former Prime Ministers Rabin and Shamir, who were members of the National Unity Government. They decided to find Vanunu at once and bring him to Israel. Some of their aides suggested killing Vanunu instead of bringing him back, but that idea was dismissed. The Prime Minister picked up the phone and called the Mossad. Since 1982, the Mossad had had a new director, Nahum Admoni. After almost 20 years of generals parachuted from the IDF to the helm of the Mossad, the organization finally had a new chief, one who had worked his way up from the inside. Nahum Admoni, born in Jerusalem, was a veteran of the Shai and of Amman. He had been Yitzhak Hafiz's deputy, and reached the coveted post of Mossad after Hafi retired in 1982. He was to spend 7 years as Mossad, but these were not to be the best years of the intelligence community. Between 1982 and 1989, several incidents embarrassed the Mossad. The Pollard Affair, which erupted when a Jewish civilian intelligence analyst was arrested in Washington for spying for a secret Israeli intelligence unit. The Iran-Contra Affair, in which Israel was involved, arrests of several Mossad agents in foreign countries because of careless blunders. But the worst damage to Israel was certainly caused by Mordecai Vanunu. As soon as Perez called him, Admoni launched an operation for capturing Vanunu. The Mossad computer spewed out the operation's code name, Kaniuk. Nahum Admoni urgently sent a Caesarea unit to Australia to find Vanunu. But on their arrival, the agents found out that they had come too late. The bird had flown the coop to England. Shortly after interviewing Guerrero, the Sunday Times editor sent Peter Honam, a star of the Insight section of the weekly, to Australia, to meet Vanunu. When he boarded his flight, Honam already knew that British scientists had examined some of the photos brought by Guerrero and confirmed their authenticity. The meeting with Vanunu in Sydney convinced Honam, as well, that his story was true. He was particularly impressed by Vanunu's denial of Guerrero's exaggerated claims that he was an Israeli scientist. Vanunu told him the truth: he had been only a technician at Dimona. Vanunu and Honam flew to London, leaving Guerrero behind. In London, Vanunu was subjected to several intensive interrogations by the Sunday Times people. He told them everything he knew, and revealed to the British that Israel was also developing a neutron bomb, capable of destroying living things but leaving buildings and structures intact. He also described the process of assembling the bombs at Institute 2. Yet, all along, he seemed scared and nervous. He feared being killed or kidnapped by the Israeli services. The Sunday Times people tried to calm him down. They moved him to another hotel and recruited all their staff to serve, in turns, as babysitters for their precious guest. They insisted, in vain, that he not walk the streets alone. When the interrogations were over, they offered him a fantastic deal: $100,000 for his story and photos, 40% of the distribution rights of the newspaper articles, and 25% of the book rights, if there were to be a book. They told him that the Sunday Times owner, Rupert Murdoch, also owned the film company 20th Century Fox, and he was thinking of making a movie about his life and times. The role of Vanunu would be played by Robert De Niro. Vanunu's hosts in London offered him all the possible temptations except one: a woman. Vanunu hungered for sex and for a woman's warmth, and could not get them. When Insight staff member Rowena Webster kept him company, he desperately tried to convince her to have sex with him, but she refused. Sex was Vanunu's Achilles heel, but the smart editors of the Sunday Times failed to realize this. They also failed to realize that Vanunu's fears of the Israeli services were justified. One of the Insight reporters was sent to Israel to find out if Vanunu indeed was who he claimed to be. He spoke about him with an Israeli journalist, who immediately alerted the Shabak. A few hours later, several members of the Mossad operational team landed in London. The team was headed by the Ramsad's deputy, Shabtai Shabbat. The operation was commanded by the Ramsad's second deputy and Caesarea's head, Beni Zeevi. Two Mossad agents, posing as press photographers, lingered by the Sunday Times building and took pictures of protesting workers, who happened to be on strike. After a few days, they saw and photographed Vanunu and followed him on London streets, using the comb method developed by veteran Mossad agent Zvi Malkin. Besides following their mark, the agents combed the areas that he might visit, and were in place even before he arrived. And so, on September 24th, Vanunu arrived at Leicester Square, a favorite site for tourists and visitors. By a newspaper stand, he saw a girl that looked very much like Farrah Fawcett, the star of the TV show Charlie's Angels. She was a pretty blonde, and to him she looked beautiful and angelic. He stared at her longingly while she stood in line in front of the newsstand. She turned her head and looked back at him, a long and meaningful look. Their eyes locked for a moment, but her turn came, she bought her paper, and went her way. He turned to go in another direction, but gathered all his courage, came back, and asked her if he could talk to her. She agreed with a smile. A casual conversation followed between the two of them. She introduced herself as Cindy, a Jewish beautician from Philadelphia, on a vacation to Europe. Vanunu was suspicious. The last few days had been nerve-wracking for him. The Sunday Times people kept interrogating him endlessly, and postponed the publication of his story. His fears of the Israeli services increased after he learned that the Sunday Times was going to ask the Israeli embassy in London for their comment on the story. They explained to him that a respectable paper like the Sunday Times always had to ask for the other side's comments. He was not convinced. He felt lonely, angry, and impatient. And all of a sudden, Cindy. "Are you from the Mossad?" he asked, half-jokingly. No, she said. No. What is Mossad? She asked him for his name. George, he said. That was the name he had used when he checked into the hotel. She smiled. Come on, she said. You're not George. When they settled in a cafe, he revealed his real name to her, and told her about the Sunday Times and his problems. She immediately suggested that he come to New York, where she could find good newspapers and good lawyers for him. But he did not listen, not really. Mordecai Vanunu fell in love at first sight. He met with Cindy several times in the next few days, and, according to him, these were the best days of his life. They walked in the parks, holding hands, went to the movies and watched Witness with Harrison Ford and Woody Allen's Hannah and her sisters. They also saw a musical, 42nd Street, and kissed a lot. The warm hugs and the sweet kisses he would never forget. Cindy gave him her sweet kisses, but firmly refused to sleep with him. She told him she could not invite him to her hotel, because she shared a room with another girl. She also refused to come to his hotel room. "You are tense and edgy," she kept saying, "it won't work. Not in London." Then she had an idea. "Why don't you come with me to Rome? My sister lives there, she's got an apartment, we can have a real good time, and you'll forget all your troubles." At first, he refused. But she was determined to go to Rome, and bought a business class ticket, and when she finally convinced him, she bought him a ticket, too. "You'll pay me back later," she said. And he succumbed to temptation. If he were a more serious and reasonable man, he would have realized right away that he had fallen into a honey trap, the Secret Service's term for a seduction by a woman. Just like that, he meets a girl in the street, and she falls for him head over heels, and is ready to do anything for him, take him to her sister's home in Rome, buy him a plane ticket even though she barely knows him. She cannot sleep with him in London, but she can sleep with him in Rome. A sensible man would have concluded that Cindy's story was suspicious, even ridiculous. But the Mossad psychologists had done an excellent job this time. They knew exactly what Vanunu wanted, and predicted that he would be driven blind by the sweet kisses and the even sweeter promises of a gorgeous, sexy woman. Peter Honam of the Sunday Times was a sensible man. As soon as he heard about Cindy, he felt something was very wrong. He tried his best to persuade Vanunu not to see her, but in vain. Vanunu had swallowed the bait already, and nothing in the world could make him change his mind. Once, he asked Peter to drive him to the cafe where Cindy was waiting for him, and Peter caught a glimpse of the young woman. Later he would be able to sketch her face, based on their brief encounter. When Peter learned of Vanunu's intention to leave town for a couple of days, he again tried to talk him out of it, but to no avail. Still, he warned Vanunu not to leave England and not to leave his passport with the reception clerks at the hotel. But even Peter Honam could not imagine that Vanunu would fly to Rome so he could, at last, sleep with his Cindy. Cindy had agreed to sleep with Vanunu in Rome for a totally different reason. Israel did not want to abduct Vanunu on British soil. Prime Minister Perez did not want to confront the formidable Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. The Mossad did not feel comfortable in Great Britain either. Only a few months before, the German authorities had found in a telephone booth a case containing 8 false British passports. Unfortunately, the case also carried a tag announcing the identity of its owner and his connection to the Israeli embassy. The British government was furious. The Mossad had to promise not to infringe on British sovereignty again. Therefore, neither Perez nor the Mossad could even think of launching a covert operation in Great Britain. Rome became the best possible choice. The relations between the Mossad and the Italian Secret Service were close and solid. The Ramsad Nahum Edmoni and Admiral Fulvio Martini, the head of the Italian Secret Service, were good friends. And with chronic chaos reigning in Italy, it was almost certain that the Italians could never prove that Vanunu was abducted on their soil. Cindy and Morty, hand in hand, boarded British Airways Flight 504 to Rome on September 30, 1986. When they landed at 9 p.m., the two lovers were met by a jolly Italian holding a huge bunch of flowers. He took them in his car to Cindy's sister's place. During the trip, Cindy kept hugging and kissing her blissful Morty. The car stopped by a small house, and a girl opened the door. Vanunu was the first to enter. Suddenly the door was slammed shut behind him, and 2 men jumped him, hit him hard, and threw him to the floor. He noticed that one of them was blonde. While they tied his hands and feet, the girl bent over him and plunged a needle in his arm. Everything became a blur, and he sank into a deep sleep. A commercial van carrying the unconscious Vanunu headed to the north of the country. The vehicle traveled for several hours. On Vanunu's side sat 2 men and 1 woman. After a few hours, Vanunu got another injection. Cindy had vanished. The car reached the port of La Spezia. Vanunu, strapped to a stretcher, was put aboard a fast speedboat that sailed to the open sea, where an Israeli freighter, Tapuz, was waiting. According to another source, it was SS Noga. The ship's crew members were ordered to enter the crew lounge and stay inside. But those on duty saw the speedboat arrive. A rope ladder was thrown overboard and 2 men and 1 woman cautiously climbed aboard. They were carrying an unconscious man and brought him to the first mate's cabin, locking the door behind them. The ship immediately sailed toward Israel. Vanunu spent the entire trip locked in the small cabin. He did not see Cindy anymore. He was worried about her and did not know what had happened to her. He did not realize that she was a member of the Mossad team. She had left him at the threshold of the safe house and probably left Italy that same night. The woman who accompanied Vanunu aboard the ship was the doctor that kept shooting him with anesthetics during the trip. The ship dropped anchor not far from the Israeli shore, and Vanunu was transferred to an Israeli Navy missile boat. He was met there by police officers and Shabak agents, who formally booked him and took him to the Shikma prison in Ashkelon. During his first interrogation, Vanunu learned that while he was on his way to Israel, the Sunday Times had started publishing the series based on his revelations. The articles, enhanced by photographs and drawings, were reproduced in scores of papers all over the world. The Sunday Times revealed that all the previous assessments of Israel's nuclear strength had been mistaken. So far, the experts believed that Israel possessed between 10 and 20 primitive atomic bombs. But the information brought by Vanunu proved that Israel had become a nuclear power, and its arsenal contained at least 150 to 200 sophisticated bombs. It also had the capability of producing hydrogen and neutron weapons. Vanunu got scared by the sensational revelations. He feared that the Israelis would kill him. He also feared for Cindy, and could not believe that she was a part of the plot against him. For about 40 days, the world did not know what had happened to Vanunu. The press published sensational reports that had nothing to do with the truth. The British papers described in full detail how he had been kidnapped in London and smuggled to Israel inside a diplomatic crate. Others quoted witnesses who had seen him with a young woman boarding a yacht that had taken him to Israel. Members of Parliament in London demanded an investigation and severe measures against Israel. Vanunu was officially indicted in mid-November and appeared in court several more times. He decided to outwit his jailers. He knew exactly where the reporters were waiting when he was brought to court. In one of the trips to the courthouse, Vanunu sat in the back seat of the police car and waited for it to stop in front of the crowd of reporters and photographers. Then, suddenly, he stuck the palm of his hand to the car window. And the reporters and photographers of the world press could read the phrase he had written on his palm. Vanunu M was hijacked in Rome, Italy, September 30, 86. 2100 hours. Came to Rome by fly BA 504. That revelation did not harm Jerusalem's relations with London, as it made clear that Vanunu had left Britain of his own free will, on a regular commercial flight. In Rome, however, the chiefs of the secret services were angry and frustrated, but after a while the Israelis repaired the damage. Vanunu was charged with espionage and treason. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison. But overseas, he was not considered a spy or a traitor. Associations and leagues in his name appeared in Europe and America almost overnight, and he was depicted as a bold fighter for peace, a martyr who risked his life to stop Israel's nuclear project. Vanunu, of course, was nothing of the kind. The heroic, ideological slogans were used only to cover the confused actions of the frustrated Institute II operator. He did not try to rise against the Israeli nuclear project while he worked at Dimona. If he had not been laid off, he might be working there this very day. Even when he left the country, he did not hurry to start his holy war. He traveled the world, toured Nepal and Thailand, got baptized in Australia. Had he not met Guerrero, he might have kept the photos of Golda's balcony and the bomb assembly labs at the bottom of his rucksack. But good and naive people throughout the world saw him as a fighter against the Israeli atomic danger. A sweet American couple adopted him as a son, even though his family was still alive, and other good Christians keep nominating him as a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. When he was released from jail, after 18 years, Vanunu chose to live in a Jerusalem church. Today he keeps displaying his hatred for Israel, refuses to live there, refuses to speak Hebrew, calls himself John Crossman, and publishes ads in the Arab newspapers, looking for an Arab or Palestinian bride, non-Israeli only. And Cindy? It turned out that because of the urgency of the operation in London, the Mossad had no time to build a solid cover for her. She used her sister's name, Cindy Hanin, and her passport, and that helped British and Israeli reporters to discover her real identity. They found out that her real name was Cheryl Ben-Tov, née Hanin, the daughter of an American millionaire who had made his fortune in the tire business. She was a devout Zionist and immigrated to Israel at the age of 17. She served in the IDF and married a former Amman officer. A Mossad agent recruited her to the organization. Her IQ was high, her motivation intense, and her American passport helpful. She went through an exhausting 2-year training course before being urgently flown to London with the other members of Operation Caniac. After Vanunu's abduction and the burst of publicity surrounding her, she had to resign from operational activity. Today Cheryl Hanin Ben-Tov lives in Orlando, Florida. She and her husband are in the real estate business, and lead the life of a model Jewish-American family. The Vanunu affair burned Cheryl as a Mossad agent, and her colleagues sincerely regret that the smart, pretty, and resourceful woman is no longer one of them. It is because of her that Israel got Vanunu out of England without breaking any laws. Margaret Thatcher easily reined in her tumultuous members of parliament once it was clear that no illegal act had been committed on British soil. But it did not take long for the Mossad to get up to its old tricks again. 2 years later, Mossad agents Ari Regev and Yaakov Bered planted a Palestinian as a double agent in London. The Palestinian was caught and arrested, but Thatcher closed the Mossad station in London and expelled Regev and Bered. The Mossad again promised to behave. And they did, until the Mahmoud al-Mabhouh affair. This is the end of part 5. Did you enjoy learning something new today? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more fascinating knowledge. Your support helps us continue bringing you engaging content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.